Welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Casper. Today we'll talk about the presidential candidates and how they would handle the economy and how their plans could affect Pennsylvania. But first, we're joined by Katie Meyer, government reporter and editor for Spotlight PA. Katie, historically, Democrats have had the registration advantage in Pennsylvania. What's the latest trend?
Well, basically, in short, Democrats are still gaining voters, but they've been doing it at a much slower rate than both Republicans and independents in recent weeks. And so what we've seen is them having a smaller and smaller percentage lead in terms of registered voters. So right now, Republicans and Democrats specifically are closer together than they've been in terms of voter registration percentage than we've seen in many, many years. Department of State data only goes back a couple of decades into the late 90s, but since then, they've never been as close as they have now.
Yeah, Katie, my understanding that Democrat registration now has the smallest advantage in Pennsylvania since 1998. So why has that edge eroded?
Well, there's a couple reasons. And the first I'll mention is just that voter registration trends, they're not the best data to measure voter enthusiasm or voter participation. I talked to a great data scientist, Lara Putnam, and she's a historian as well. And she was saying she kind of calls them a noisy measure of engagement. And that's because a lot of things that are not related to enthusiasm or engagement affect registration. So the big ones for Democrats have been two really big registration bumps that they saw in the past. One was in the 60s at the height of the labor movement when labor, was driving Democratic registration in Pennsylvania. The other was during the Obama years, during Obama's first and second campaigns. There was a big bump in the 60s and 70s, and then another big bump in 2008, 2012. And what we're seeing now is those numbers receding. People who, are baby boomers who registered in that first wave, people are passing away. And of the Obama years, many people were very young when they first voted. Many have moved away. Others just have not continued to be engaged. So those are people who weren't necessarily still voting for Democrats anyway. There was just a little bit of what we call like a hangover from those registration bumps that is just correcting. So part of that is just normal trends. The other part is that Democrats just were not seeing really good registration numbers in the last couple of years. And we can talk a little bit more about that for sure.
Well, Katie, what happened to Democrats' registration after Joe Biden dropped out of the race and Kamala Harris got in?
So I'll preface this by giving a little bit more context, which is the Democrats saw a registration bump when Roe v. Wade was overturned. But since then, during the Biden administration, the registration really, really cratered. It was not just like they weren't just losing a share of voters by percentage. They were actually losing voters. Their raw numbers were going down. And so that was bad. It was unusually bad for Democrats. So now what they've seen since Kamala Harris jumped into the race, Joe Biden stepped out, is those numbers have stabilized. They're not losing numbers by like raw vote number anymore. However, they are still losing them by percentage, which means that Republicans and independents, their share of voters is still rising faster. So basically, Larry, the share of voters that Democrats have, it is stabilized a little bit. They're not losing numbers anymore, but they're still, Republicans are still making up ground, and as are, again, independents.
What does it mean anyway, Katie, philosophically, to be a Democrat anymore? Has that changed in recent years?
Oh, I mean, that's a big question. And I think it depends on, it changes for different people. So I don't know if I can say philosophically what it means for folks, but I do think that a lot of Democrats who I've spoken to in the lead up to this election, they positioned themselves, in opposition to Donald Trump. People think that Donald Trump is a pretty uniquely negative force in American democracy. Of course, people also think that he's good. So, it depends on who you are. But yeah, I think a lot of Democrats for sure see themselves in opposition to Trump. You hear a lot of, especially around young people, frustration with both parties. They don't love either one. But, the Democrats have really leaned into, thinking of themselves in opposition to Trump. So that's a big part of it.
Now, as a reporter, Katie, that Philadelphia politics is dominated by Democrats. What does fewer Democratic registrations mean come November, especially in this hotbed of Democrats?
Sure. So I live in Philadelphia. I've done a lot of work talking to voters in and around Philadelphia. Basically, Philadelphia is just a gigantic source of votes for Democrats. And so when turnout is bad, not just registration, but actual people who are going to go to the polls, then Democrats don't do as well. And this has been a concern not just this year, it's been a concern in many recent years, starting in really 2020, 2022, the midterm. Philadelphia's turnout was not that great. It was lower than the sort of average share of turnout across the state. So, yeah, I mean, it's a big deal. Philadelphia is a huge focus for a lot of Democrats.
As far as you can tell, Katie, how active are the major parties in motivating Pennsylvanians to register to vote?
They're quite active. I mean, you know, you might have noticed, anybody who's watching today and is a voter who lives in Pennsylvania, there are ads everywhere. You're getting mailers, you're getting canvassers at your door. There are a lot of different initiatives. So some of them are from the parties themselves, some are from your local committee for whatever party is most active there, or both. And some of them are from interest groups, outside interest groups who have a vested interest in a certain candidate. So you'll see Planned Parenthood, for instance, doing voter outreach efforts across the state for Democrats. So, you know, to answer your question, yeah, of course, there's always a lot of action. And there's sometimes, you know, especially in places like Philadelphia, where, you know, there's a complicated ward system overseen by the city Democratic Committee. There's always tension between people who think that the committee should be doing something different or something better. And so, you know, but point blank, yes, a ton of activity is happening all over the place.
Katie, here's my last question, and hopefully this gets to the relevance of the report you recently filed. How useful are registration numbers in predicting action at the polls?
Yeah, so I mentioned before, it's kind of a noisy measure. It is not a perfect measure of engagement. So if you're looking for, you know, something that's going to give you a really, really good sense of exactly what's going to happen, registration's not it. However, it can show big trends. So, you know, Democrats not doing as well in registration numbers for the last couple of years. Of course, it means something. It just doesn't mean everything. So usually we take that as one measure, and then you look at polling, or you look at, you know, small groups who are answering questions in a more consistent way for people. Those kind of things, you know, all of it kind of comes together to give you a sense of what might happen.
Katie Meyer of Spotlight PA, thank you very much.
Thank you.
More of the PCN Capitol Preview after a short break. Welcome back. Our guest today is David Taylor, President and CEO of the PA Manufacturers Association. Welcome, David.
Thanks very much, Larry.
Inflation is on everyone's mind. 2 years ago, President Biden signed a law called the Anti-Inflation Reduction Act. What did that accomplish?
Well, the Inflation Reduction Act was rather badly misnamed because the lion's share of the considerable spending in that bill was actually directed at subsidizing alternative energy sources. So the inflation had peaked right before that bill was passed, and so inflation, the rate of increase in inflation did recede, but I wouldn't attribute that actually to the passage of that legislation.
It had more to do with alternative energy than everyday concerns like prices at the supermarket.
Well, it's the expansion of the money supply that the American Rescue Plan, which was the first spending bill out of the gate, was a massive infusion of money into an economy that was already recovering. And so, again, what drives inflation? When there's too much money chasing too few goods, and that the American Rescue Plan really is what lit the fuse on inflation.
Well, David, let's try to get into the kitchen table issue here of what Kamala Harris calls price gouging at the supermarket. And naturally, people want to know what can be done. Are there any ideas from either candidate?
I mean, the most important thing is to reduce those cost driving factors in the marketplace. I take profound exception to that line of argumentation. Senator Casey started off the year with that, and I push back pretty hard that his thinking there is that wet streets cause rain, rather than to say that the businesses are attempting to provide goods and services in the business environment that's been created with the massive inflation that was let loose by massive government overspending, which, again, Senator Casey voted for every last bit of it.
Well, on the subject of Democrats, then, certainly let's pivot to Kamala Harris, then. What's in her campaign lately that's attracting attention like Casey tried to attract early in his campaign?
Well, again, it's a line of argumentation to attempt to evade responsibility for the problem that the Biden-Harris administration has caused. One of the best ways to combat inflation is to lower the cost of energy. Yet this administration has been very much against expanding or even maintaining domestic energy production. The first thing President Biden did upon taking office was to shut down the Keystone XL pipeline, that he rescinded leases that had been granted on the North Slope of Alaska for petroleum drilling. Similarly with leases in the Gulf of Mexico, and of course, most recently, this moratorium on approving exports of liquefied natural gas. All of those things have worked against domestic energy production. And furthermore, there's also been an absolute avalanche of anti-energy, anti-development regulation out of the Biden administration. So when you increase the cost of harvesting energy, of deploying energy, you make energy scarcer, you make it more expensive. And of course, every single step of production in making a product and delivering that product to the marketplace, every step of that requires energy. So higher energy prices, cumulatively, that's what drives inflation.
You mentioned the Keystone Pipeline a minute ago. Tell us more about what that project is, its significance. It would run across half the country, wouldn't it?
Yes. So the Keystone XL pipeline was a project of a Canadian company, TC, formerly TransCanada, that would connect oil drilling in the prairie provinces in Western Canada with the U.S. Petroleum market, and especially to deliver that Canadian crude to U.S. refineries in Louisiana. And that, again, I think it makes perfect sense, both from an economic standpoint and from a geostrategic standpoint, to draw closer to our next door neighbor, largest trading partner, closest ally, Canada, to help them to get their energy to market, and for us to be able to refine that and make use of that for consumers here in the U.S. And so it's really disheartening. The Obama administration delayed the approval of the pipeline. During the Trump administration, approval was given, and in fact, the part of the pipeline crossing the U.S.-Canada border is complete. But President Biden just yanked it, yanked the permit, even though no one has claimed that TC, failed to meet any U.S. law or U.S. regulation. So it's really very distressing. And also, President Biden promised those workers so-called green jobs, and not one of them has gotten one.
David, back to the subject of inflation. You said that the Biden administration caused inflation. So let's talk about what candidate Trump could possibly offer to repudiate any Biden policies.
Well, I think just returning to the policies that were in place previously during the Trump administration, which is a pro-production, a pro-deployment agenda for domestic energy, including also building out infrastructure to increase delivery of that energy from where it's harvested to the downstream consumers who can benefit from it. Also, stopping this avalanche of regulations that has fallen upon the industry. That the Trump administration had focused on regulatory reform, whereby for every new regulation enacted, that 2 old regulations had to be taken off the book. There needs to be a kind of budgeting of the regulatory burden so it doesn't just go up and up and up.
Donald Trump wants to impose new tariffs on foreign imports, and this has been in the news quite a bit.
Right.
What details are known? What exactly does he want to do?
Well, it's a very general statement on the part of Donald Trump, which is often the case, and that tariffs are a rather blunt instrument, so it matters how they are deployed. But I mean, I would say that there are good reasons for America to support domestic manufacturing and to defend our domestic employers, domestic producers from unfair and predatory foreign practices. I mean, we have seen, especially in the part of China, massive subsidization of domestic industries in those countries, and then dumping those products into the U.S. marketplace. I mean, Larry, we hear stories where a Pennsylvania company bid on a global contract, and their domestic competitor bid also, and that the two bids from the U.S. Companies were very, very close together, and yet somehow a Chinese company comes in and gives a lowball bid that is below the cost of raw materials to the American producers. Like, that's not mathematically possible unless somebody is cheating. And in those kinds of circumstances, it's appropriate for our government to step in and rebalance the scales.
Well, how would tariff rates be affected for China? My understanding about Trump's idea is that the tariff for China would be considerably higher than other foreign countries.
Well, yes, and this is the thing. I mean, I would argue that trade is for allies, that America, that we should use our economic strength in support of our national interests and our allies and our shared values. So to have an open door with other countries that have representative self-government and an independent judiciary and a free press. Like, those are the kinds of countries who we want to do business with so we can mutually support one another. But when there are unfree countries, especially as in China, where slave labor is a large part of their production, that I think just the conscience requires us to take appropriate countermeasures, that no American worker should have to compete with slave labor, and that no American consumer should be exposed to slave-made goods in the domestic marketplace.
Well, David, let me steer you back to the kitchen table and consider, if Donald Trump is elected for another term as president and goes ahead with these higher tariffs, what's the impact on Americans?
Well, I mean, it really depends. It depends on how well thought out the tariffs are, how they're applied.
So more detail is in order?
Well, I think so. But again, I think that the underlying principle or intent behind that plan is to prefer domestic manufacturing. And that not only does it matter where your stuff is made, manufacturing is critical to the success of our economy and our society, because manufacturing is the sector that adds the most value and as a result offers the best wages and benefits in the marketplace, family-sustaining jobs. It has the strongest multiplier effect on job creation, that core manufacturing function sustains additional jobs in supply chains and distribution networks and the vendors that serve what happens on the plant floor. Also, our manufacturing employers are significant local taxpayers. So when you think about what sustains quality of life in our communities, that to have family-sustaining jobs, a strong local tax base, and overall economic dynamism, like, there are good reasons to want those things, and President Trump has said that he does.
Well, how does our current rate of inflation compare to years past? Try to put this in perspective, what we're experiencing right now.
Well, it's been the inflation that we've had since President Biden took office is the highest since 1982, when President Reagan took on the inflation crisis, and we went through a recession to finally, squeeze out inflation and shut it down. Of course, the cumulative impact of high inflation over time is still being felt, because wages did not rise accordingly with inflation, that people still feel the pinch, that their purchasing power overall has been reduced.
And an important component of a discussion about the economy is the Federal Reserve. So let's start right at the beginning, David, and let's consider Federal Reserve 101. Just what is it briefly?
Well, I mean, it's the entity that oversees the money supply in the U.S., and it also is the entity.
Sounds like a bank.
Well, it is, in a manner of speaking. It's a private institution, which is strange. There are people in Congress who believe that our federal government should have much more control over it than we do, although the officers who are in charge of the reserve are, in fact, nominated by the president, confirmed by Congress. It also is the entity that sets interest rates. And so we just saw recent news that the Federal Reserve did reduce interest rates. Whether that's economically appropriate at this time or not is under question. But in a lot of ways, it's a black box. So I wouldn't presume to speak in depth about the Federal Reserve.
Well, let me put it this way, David. The candidates, Trump and Kamala Harris, have contrasting opinions on the significance or the impact or relevance of the Federal Reserve. In other words, Trump says, as president, he wants to have more influence on what the Federal Reserve does. Did you hear that comment? Or so, what does he mean by that? What kind of influence?
I think that speaks to the issue that I brought up about the degree of control of the federal government over the reserve itself, as opposed to the reserve being an institution at arm's length and less directly controlled by our elected representatives.
And Kamala Harris says she wants to keep her hands off of that if she's elected.
And I will leave the economists to handle that. I mean, the incredible increase that we have seen in the money supply is just terribly irresponsible. The increase in spending that we have seen in the recent era is tremendously irresponsible. That upon President Biden taking office, that the Democrats in Congress locked in place the much higher levels of spending at the COVID level, which was supposed to be emergency spending, rather than going back to the pre-COVID level. We have seen, like this year, we are likely to have our first ever $2 trillion annual budget deficit. That we have seen the national debt essentially double over the last 4 years, and that the balance sheet at the Fed is truly terrifying. The amount of money that they're out continues to increase. It's at historically high levels.
Sounds like you're getting into the federal deficit. And again, that's one of those inevitable components of any discussion about the economy.
Right.
Government is spending more than it collects.
Right. And that the national debt, so that the annual deficit is how much further in debt we got this year. The national debt is the cumulative amount of money on the books that the federal government owes. And we are now at the point where the federal government owes more than the U.S. economy generates in an entire year. We have not been at that level of indebtedness since the height of the Second World War, which of course was the very definition of emergency spending. So for this to happen in peacetime is without precedent. I would argue that it's very dangerous and unhealthy, especially since we are facing dangers around the world. We have war going on in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and the threat of war in the Pacific with China preparing to invade Taiwan. That for us to be this indebted, for our borrowing to be constrained at a time when we're going to need to arm up is itself a huge threat to our national security.
Since the United States holds a lot of debt then, David, then just tell us then, what are the consequences? What happens when we're in the state we're in?
Well, borrowing is constrained, and that our ability to spend money on our own priorities is much less. We're at the point now where the annual interest payment on the federal debt is over $1 trillion a year. So we're paying $1,000 billion a year, which is like half of the take from the personal income tax in the U.S. We're spending that just on interest on the debt, and we're at a point where, with increases in mandatory spending programs and interest on the debt, which of course you have to pay, that it's going to reduce the discretionary spending, which includes, of course, the defense budget. So it puts us in very serious constraints, and the only way we're going to get out of it is to slam the brakes on spending, and also to enact policies that are going to accelerate economic growth. Only by having fiscal discipline and strong economic growth do we have any chance of getting out of this doom loop.
So if it's out of control and we're in a doom loop, why is it allowed to even happen, David? What's your theory?
Well, it's very scary. And ultimately it comes back to us as citizens that our federal republic and our system of American government is based on the premise of an informed and engaged citizenry. And if the politicians can just keep telling us what we want to hear and bribe us with our own money, then this is how we come to a place that we have arrived to right now. And I would also say that Donald Trump, with his spending plans, really at this point is exhibiting no more discipline or proposing any more discipline or constraint than you would see from Vice President Harris.
So the effect of high interest rates, I mean, can really have an impact on federal programs.
Well, yes, that because the interest rate, of course, applies to that national debt, which is larger than the entire economy now. And so when interest rates go higher, that makes the burden heavier. And of course, also that the high interest rates have made it harder for American consumers to do things like buy a home. It drives mortgage rates up.
Mm-hmm. We're going to give you a break just for a minute, David,
Okay.
because we're going to look at program notes for here on PCN. Former Governor Tom Corbett is the featured guest at the Pennsylvania Press Club luncheon today. He'll tell us about a group called Keep Our Republic. They're trying to restore the public's trust in our elections. That's live today at 12:30 p.m. And while we're on the subject of voting, we want you to meet the candidates whose names are appearing on the ballot in November. Our series of interviews features the hopefuls running for U.S. Senate, Congress, and the state row offices. It all gets started Wednesday at 7 p.m. For more detail on who's being featured and the offices they're running for, visit our website at pcntv.com. A Journalist Roundtable returns with Kim Lyons from the PA Capitol Star, Julia Taruso from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Justin Schweitzer from City and State PA. Will tell us all about the latest developments at the state capitol on Thursday at 7 p.m. The public affairs coverage you watch on PCN TV is now free on the internet. Go to pcntv.com and check out our streaming service, PCN Select. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network that receives no government funding. We rely on viewers and donors like you to help PCN bring you everything Pennsylvania. To make a donation, visit pcntv.com. David Taylor is our guest today. We're talking about how the presidential candidates would handle the economy. And let's try to continue the discussion we had a couple minutes ago, David. How would either candidate handle, as far as we're talking about spending and accumulating debt? That was our big subject.
Right.
So what are the candidates specifically saying about any policy they might consider?
Well, I mean, that Vice President Harris, when she was a U.S. Senator and a presidential candidate in her own right, that she, has supported and has voted for all of those massive spending increases. Well, she's proposed a lot of things that would be exceedingly expensive. President Trump also has some spending plans that are aggressive, but not nearly on the same scale. What really concerns me is that from neither camp have we heard anything about how do we get more value out of the dollars being spent. President Trump has already said that the mandatory spending programs of Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, that those things are off limits. Well, when those things are the great drivers of the growth of government spending, I would think that it would be prudent and responsible to look at those programs and examine how well or how poorly those programs are functioning, what degree of fraud and waste, because those programs, their advocates will say, well, they have very low overhead, and that's a good thing. Well, that means they have low overhead because nobody's watching them. And so in many ways, these programs have become engines of fraud because they're so easy to take advantage of. Actually, that you've seen instances where organized crime and terrorist networks have raised money by defrauding those social service programs. And I think we can all agree the dollars that are spent in that program should go to providing assistance to the Americans who qualify for them, and that those dollars should be spent well to make sure that those real live individual Americans get the help that they need, whether it's in healthcare or with the SNAP program, with groceries. These are things that should work the way they were intended. They're just on autopilot. And somebody needs to have the guts to say, we need to make sure that these programs are working effectively. When Speaker of the House Paul Ryan of Wisconsin, attempted to address these things, of course, he was accused of wanting to push grandma off a cliff. And those sorts of insults will be directed at whoever steps forward. But Larry, the fact is we have to deal with these things before the reckoning comes. As it stands, Social Security is supposed to undergo, Social Security and Medicare are going to have mandatory across the board 20 to 25% cuts starting in 2037. The Social Security disability program is going to be bankrupt, I think, within a year. So insofar as you have American citizens who depend on these programs, it's a moral imperative for our leaders to ensure that they're functioning correctly, that they're delivering the aid that these needy people require, and that the programs aren't being wasteful, misdirected, or defrauded. And sadly, I haven't heard word one from either camp on the subject, again, because it's a political liability and it's very easily misrepresented.
It sounds like you're making a stark distinction between value and the amount of money that's spent on a program.
Exactly.
And maybe some subjective judgment is required. Obviously, it would be, as far as oversight is concerned, which you're saying we lack.
Yes, very much so. I heard it described to me in this way, that like with Medicare, that an analysis is done as to whether the service that is covered is appropriate for this particular patient. They don't check whether that patient actually exists. And so we need to have appropriate oversight. So, because these are massive, we spend like a very serious percentage of our total national wealth on these programs every year. Our leaders should ensure that they work properly.
Let's consider, I'm going to take you back to the kitchen table, as I've referred to it a couple times already. So that means a discussion about jobs has to come up.
Right.
And CNN is reporting that the job market is flashing warning signs lately. And I think everyone's agreed that unemployment is the highest it's been, at least in the last 3 years. Like, we enjoyed a very low rate, and now it seems like it's creeping up again. Yeah,
you've heard business advocates like me and others say for a long time the challenges that we're having with the workforce, with finding enough qualified workers to fill available jobs, and that this is a long-term societal trend.
And people have to come after those jobs too.
This is true. We need to have folks with the skills, or people who are trainable to acquire those skills. And yeah, we need. How can I say it the right way?
Take your time.
We need to get into a virtuous cycle where we as a society show that we value all kinds of work. So, like, going back to when I was a kid, it was the work smart, not hard, that every student has to go after a 4-year degree, and if you don't do that, you're going to waste your life and be a loser and will be ashamed of you. Well, in fact, there are great careers in manufacturing, in the skilled trades, that our society requires those jobs, and that yes, that college is great for eggheads like me.
Sounds like certain things have to be destigmatized.
Well, that's exactly right, and so we need to eliminate that stigma, and more than that, to actually show young people that this option of a non-academic course is not only sustainable, but actually highly profitable, and that it's not the end. So, like, in many instances, you have a situation where a person will go and will get an RN degree, and then will work through college pre-med to then go on to med school, in the same way that somebody gets a certificate to become an electrician, works through college to get the undergraduate degree to become an engineer.
Sounds like a certain strategy in order to go over a path.
It's not the end. And I think that we again, I wish it was more commonly understood how valuable these jobs are, not just in terms of what they pay, but also valuable to society, that all of us who enjoy modern civilization, we need all these makers and doers to build these systems, to power them, to staff them, and that it's a paradox that we as consumers experience so many of these things seamlessly And that's part of what's designed for the customer experience. But it's made us stop thinking about how these things are made or delivered. I mean, you go to the grocery store and you see 10,000 choices arrayed around you. And, if you see a hand of bananas, you might think about a boat from the Caribbean or something. But, who stops to think about the refrigeration tech who worked on the truck at the frozen food company to make sure that your favorite frozen dish, frozen pizza, whatever, arrives at the grocery store?
A lot of things had to be done before that item came into the store.
Exactly. And when you start... And again, as an advocate for manufacturing, this is the way that my worldview has been realigned. But there are so many people who we depend on, the makers and the doers. We need as a society to show that we value all of those things.
Remember when Tom Ridge was running for governor, he said all work has dignity. That was a while ago. I'm probably dating myself.
Well, and that's the absolute truth, and it's an important message. And that Governor Ridge, was and is right. And I think that's something else that... again, I wish was more commonly understood, the sense of purpose that can come from mastering a trade. That there's a wonderful institution called the Williamson College of the Trades in Delaware County. And this institution it's a 3-year program, young men only, it's needs-based, and it's a full ride. And so this institution, which is a lot like a military academy, that not only does it impart these different industrial disciplines, it's also a character-building institution. And so that these young men who come from nothing, that they have the purpose and the dignity of their trade and that sense of self. I am an electrician.
I like what you said about mastering a craft.
Yes.
That's a good word.
Yes.
As far as jobs are concerned, to the presidential candidates, certainly this is familiar ground to them. So what are the candidates saying?
Well, I mean, it's important to note that during the Biden administration, the great growth in employment came from government itself, which, again, it's not sustainable. We need organic growth in the economy. And, I would point to the Republican side and to the Trump record of a pro-production agenda being the way forward. We can't just keep hiring people for government and expanding the drain of government on the private economy. We need a strong private economy to be able to pay for the government that we need.
Now, given your manufacturer's background, David, I'm considering immigration policy, and certainly that's in the news.
Right.
So what about the impact on the economy, whatever's being proposed?
Well, I mean, the situation with immigration, to me, is very serious. That the inability or the unwillingness of the Biden-Harris administration to enforce American law and uphold the integrity of citizenship is a great danger to us all. That the Congressional Budget Office estimates that at least 9 million foreigners have entered the U.S. illegally since 2021, and certainly there were many more before then who managed to get into our country.
Was that due to a lack of oversight? Going back to you used that word earlier.
Oh, completely. And it's more than that. It's sort of a willful decision to not enforce the law, that President Trump had battled illegal immigration more or less to a standstill, and immediately upon entering office that President Biden, with executive orders, reversed all of those things. And so, it distorts the workforce. We've seen gains in employment for non-Americans at a rate much faster than that of American workers. And again, if you believe in an honest market and real economics, that bringing in unskilled foreign labor depresses the wages of native-born workers. And we should want people to have family-sustaining jobs and not to have their wages artificially deflated.
Well, let's say, David, let's just say that the next president has a new immigration policy and it results in mass deportation. What's the result on jobs that just go unfilled?
Well, I mean, it depends. If we have a system of illegal immigration where America gets to choose who comes and who stays, and that we look for people who have the talents to do the work that needs to be done, and I would say equally importantly, people who want to come here for the purpose of becoming Americans, people who agree to the social compact, recognizing the great American tradition of representative self-government, pluralism, freedom of conscience, respect for the rule of law. Like, we want those people who want to be Americans and who want to bring their talents here to our country. I mean, the dangerous situation that we're in now is that we have people coming who we don't know who they are at all, men of military age, tens of thousands, for example, of Chinese. And I mean, I am very concerned that there are already saboteurs and people with malign intent who've already infiltrated the country. We are not immune from an October 7 type attack in this country, which is why we need to know who's here. I mean, in Venezuela—
You mean December 7th, don't you?
No, not a Pearl Harbor, but an October 7, as we saw with Hamas in Israel, right. The attack of soft targets, of civilians. We don't know who these people are. We don't know why they're here. We do know that the dictatorship in Venezuela has emptied their prisons for the purpose of sending their criminal gang members here to the U.S. Those are the people who we heard about in Aurora, Colorado, who took over apartment complexes with automatic weapons, attempting to establish a stronghold there. I mean, it's very scary stuff. And just, again, respect for the rule of law, protecting the American people, and upholding the integrity of citizenship. I would think that these would be priorities for anybody who would, take the oath as president.
Let's turn our attention to one of the priorities of Kamala Harris, and she recently announced that she wants a home buyer tax credit. So she's proposing a $25,000 tax credit for first-time home buyers. On the surface, that's rousing news. Can you go deeper?
Well, I mean, it's like the dog chasing his tail. I mean, we have seen massive increases in the rate of college tuition following federal subsidization of student loans and Pell Grants and all those sorts of things, that we declare this to be a good that people should have, and government then works to subsidize it, and as a result, the price goes up. So I think that that the home buyer tax credit is foolhardy, and a much better way of reducing the costs of housing would be, again, to deport 9 million plus illegal aliens who are competing with American citizens for housing, and to lift all the restrictions against timbering and sawmills and the building of houses that the Biden administration has put in place. Make it easier for producers to produce. That's how you lower costs. That's how you make it more affordable. How do you fight inflation, to keep inflation down, to keep mortgage rates down? You maximize domestic energy production, so again, that every step of production costs less, or at least the upward pressure on each step is less, because energy is more available, meeting consumer demand, lowering prices.
And as far as housing production is concerned, we have to keep in mind the context for this discussion. Very simply, demand is way up and supply is down.
Yes, sir. That's exactly right. That's what drives prices up. So, if you want to lower prices, you have to increase supply. And all of the environmental impact rules and things that the Biden-Harris administration have supported have worked against that.
Here's the phrase you hear bandied about during the campaign, and that's income inequality. I mean, there's going to be a gap anyway. That's inevitable. But is it getting bigger?
Well, it depends. I'm sorry, I keep answering it depends. Can you build up the weak by tearing down the strong? No, you cannot. How is wealth calculated? We have the benefit of a market economy that is delivering goods and services that were completely unimaginable to our grandparents. So how do you factor in that difference in terms of quality of life? The income inequality question, to me, is wrong-headed, and it's used as an excuse to try to breed envy, which is unhealthy, and that instead the better way to look at it is, first of all, to count our blessings by putting things in a proper context. that we live in an incredibly prosperous time with technologies and other benefits that are borderline miraculous. But yes, we need to be concerned about our citizens and their purchasing power, and that this is why inflation has been such a great evil. There are many, many people who, with their household budgets, they're just trying to make it to the end of the month. They're trying to make ends meet, and it's because they feel directly the loss of purchasing power, and that increased fear that we're not going to make it to the end of the month. This is why there's so much discontent and a real roiling of our politics.
We still have a few minutes left, David, so let's just consider the subject of taxes in general. Now, Kamala Harris is saying that she will not raise taxes for households making $400,000, I guess less than $400,000 a year. And also, it's worth considering that her opponent, Donald Trump, he made changes to taxes when he was president, and maybe it's easy to forget that they're still in effect today.
Correct. And so the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was one of the prime authors was, my friend, then U.S. Senator Pat Toomey, and that set of tax changes is what really accelerated growth during President Trump's time in office, in addition to the maximizing energy production and restricting increase in regulations. A lot of those things in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act were important for manufacturers, that it brought the corporate rate in the U.S. in line with our main economic competitors, the other developed nations, whereas before ours was much higher. It also eliminated a penalty for U.S. firms overseas returning their profits back to the U.S. Those are important things to keep. It also had accelerated depreciation for assets. Basically, it doesn't increase the tax relief. It just brings it forward in time, so you get it immediately upon purchasing a piece of gear. A lot of times that makes the purchase of the equipment possible in the first place.
Our guest has been David Taylor, President and CEO of the PA Manufacturers Association. David, thank you for being here.
It's my great pleasure, Larry. Thank you.
PCN's Ellen France talked to David Masur from Penn Environment about lead in school drinking water.
David Mazur, Executive Director of Penn Environment Research and Policy Center, welcome to our program. For those who may not be familiar, can you tell us what Penn Environment is?
Sure. Penn Environment is a statewide, citizen-based, nonprofit environmental advocacy group. So we work to promote clean air and clean water and protecting Pennsylvania's great outdoor places and natural heritage.
Penn Environment recently released a study involving lead in school drinking water. What did that study find?
Well, unfortunately, our study showed and added information that was already out there, but showed that essentially lead in school drinking water is unfortunately common in school buildings all across Pennsylvania. And then when it comes to implementing best practices or even complying with some of the most basic laws we have on the books around lead in drinking water, the majority of school districts that we reviewed data for were in violation of the law. And all of them were essentially avoiding implementing best practices that would protect school children from the threat of lead in school drinking water.
Did something happen that tipped you off into looking into this?
Well, we did this report because, as I mentioned, there is some data out there. I mean, it's sort of a glass half empty, glass half full. Most school districts are not required and do not report data about lead in school drinking water, which is a huge problem because if we don't know how the extent of the problem, we don't know how to solve it. But for the data that we do have, what we know is the vast majority of school districts do have lead in drinking water. A recent study showed that over 90% of school districts that reported data to the Pennsylvania Department of Education about their lead testing were reporting that lead contamination existed in their schools. So our report was really meant to get under the hood and see, get a better sense, are school districts implementing the best practices, which are essentially to replace all the old drinking fountains in every school building. with new lead filtering water bottle filling stations and lead filtering drinking fountains. And what we found, basically through our data, nearly all school districts are not doing that at the speed and breadth and depth required. And most school districts don't even share basic information with parents, teachers, and community members to even know the extent of the problem. Some of those are a violation of best practice, but some of them actually end up to be a violation of Pennsylvania law.
Why is lead in drinking water at schools so common throughout the state?
Well, it's a whole set of reasons. I mean, we basically have older school buildings, and lead can exist everywhere from the service line, which is the pipe out under the sidewalk running into the building carrying water, and then the soldering behind the walls, holding the pipes together, the pipes themselves, the valves. And actually until 2014, which is fairly recently, drinking fountains themselves were allowed to have incredibly high levels of lead. So even if you replace the pipes, you could put kids at risk just from the drinking fountain itself. So all of that older infrastructure combined with the fact that, shockingly, schools are exempt from the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act when it comes to lead in drinking water. A lot of folks don't know that, and it's a huge loophole that when the law was originally written, schools were exempt. So that creates no backstop. There's no legal limit. Schools can have lead thousands of times higher than what's considered safe in our schools. And sadly, there's nothing legal. So you have no legal repercussions. So all of those things create this sort of toxic cocktail that we find a lot of lead. Schools aren't motivated to fix the problem rapidly. And that's why the ultimate fix, the best and cheapest fix, is just to replace the drinking fountain itself. So you're treating the water at the point of discharge versus the very expensive fix of pulling all the pipes out of every school in Pennsylvania.
How can the state legislature get involved with this issue?
Well, the good news is that I think we've seen some leadership, and it's bipartisan. Protecting kids from lead should be a bipartisan issue. And there are bills in both the State House and Senate that would tackle this problem. Senate Bill 986, introduced by Senator Devlin Robinson from Western Pennsylvania, and then House Bill 2011, introduced by Representative Ronnie Green and Tara Khan from Philadelphia. Both would basically require every school district in Pennsylvania to implement the fix that I mentioned, which is that they would have to replace every drinking fountain in every school building in their district over the next year or two. And then it also includes funding so that we can help districts pay for the bill to do that and make it a more rapid change.
David Mazur, Executive Director of Penn Environment Research and Policy Center, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to Ellen Frantz for that report. The topic tomorrow on Capitol Preview will be Pennsylvania's election law. Our guests will be the chairs of the Senate State Government Committee, Chris Dush and Amanda Capoletti. That's tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. That's it for today's Capitol Preview. I'm Larry Casper. Thanks for watching.